Few wars in history have confused the soldiers who fought in them as much as the Vietnam War. Imagine being 19 or 20 years old, growing up hearing heroic stories of World War II, stories of clear front lines, visible enemies, battles that ended in victory or defeat, and then landing in a place where none of those rules seemed to exist. That's exactly what thousands of young Americans discovered when their helicopters began landing on Vietnamese soil in the late 1960s. The first impact wasn't just visual, it was sensory. The heat was thick, almost liquid, as if the air had weight. The jungle seemed to breathe. The smell of wet earth, helicopter fuel, and crushed vegetation mingled strangely. Many soldiers would later remember a curious detail. Even before hearing gunfire, they heard silence. A strange silence, broken only by insects and the distant sounds of the jungle. And in that silence, something seemed wrong. Because the war they expected to find wasn't there. There were no front lines. There were no columns of advancing enemy tanks. There were no cities occupied by enemy troops. There were only small villages, narrow paths, and a constant feeling that someone was watching. Some soldiers noticed this on their very first day of patrol. During the day, the villages seemed ordinary. Farmers working in rice paddies, women carrying baskets, children running along the road. Nothing seemed threatening. But then night came, and it was as if the world changed its identity. The jungle became dark in a way that many Americans had never experienced. It wasn't just a lack of light, it was a living darkness, full of sounds that no one could identify with certainty. Branches breaking, leaves rustling, a distant crack. Sometimes it was just an animal, sometimes it wasn't. Some veterans said years later that the hardest thing to explain to someone who had never been there was this permanent feeling of doubt. You didn't know if you were alone. You didn't know who was friend or foe. And this uncertainty created a constant tension that no military training could truly simulate. Interestingly, many soldiers began to notice small details that seemed insignificant at first, but which slowly raised disturbing questions. For example, why did some villages seem too empty during certain patrols? Why did trails that appeared to be used suddenly disappear into the vegetation? Why were American units sometimes attacked in areas that had been considered completely safe just a few hours before? An infantry sergeant wrote something simple but revealing in his diary. The feeling is that the enemy isn't fighting us. He's waiting. Waiting for what? This question began to circulate among many units. Waiting for the right moment, waiting for reinforcements, or waiting for something the Americans hadn't yet noticed? It was then that strange reports began to emerge. A soldier stepped on a piece of wood that sank slightly into the ground. Another noticed that a pile of leaves was arranged in an artificial way. Elsewhere, someone swore they saw a man literally disappear into the ground. At first, many officers thought these reports were exaggerations caused by the stress of the jungle. But war has a peculiar way of revealing the truth, even when no one is prepared for it. In a seemingly routine operation near the Cu Chi region, a group of soldiers found something that appeared to be just a small opening in the ground, almost invisible beneath leaves and compacted earth. It was too small to be considered important, but when they began to investigate, they noticed something that made everyone fall silent for a few seconds. That opening wasn't just a hole, it was an entrance. An entrance to something no one there expected to find. And when they finally illuminated the interior with a flashlight, they realized that the earth beneath them was empty. Not empty in the sense of an isolated hole. Empty in the sense of a path. A path that disappeared into the darkness. At that moment, some soldiers began to realize that perhaps the war in Vietnam wasn't just happening on the surface. Perhaps another war was happening right there, just beneath their feet. And the question that no one could ignore at that moment was simple, yet unsettling. If the enemy was living underground, how far did this subterranean world really extend? At first, many soldiers thought that opening in the ground was just another makeshift hiding place. In war, small holes were nothing new. In any conflict, combatants look for ways to hide, protect supplies, or escape bombardments. But when the men began to carefully remove the leaves and earth covering that entrance, they realized something that completely changed how they viewed that war. The hole didn't just lead to a hiding place, it led to a corridor. A narrow corridor dug directly into the earth that disappeared into the darkness as if it were the door to another world. Some soldiers knelt down to get a better look. The flashlight only illuminated a few meters ahead. After that, there was only shadow. The silence that followed at that moment was strange. It wasn't immediate fear. It was something harder to explain. It was the feeling of having discovered something that shouldn't exist there. Because that tunnel didn't seem makeshift. It seemed planned, and this raised a question that no one there was sure how to answer. How many of these tunnels could exist? In the following days, other patrols began to find similar entrances. Some were hidden under pieces of bamboo. Others were disguised inside abandoned huts. Some were so well camouflaged that a soldier could step on them and never realize he was standing on an underground structure. Gradually, the reality began to become clear. This was not a series of isolated hiding places. It was a network, and not a small network. It was an entire underground system built over years. Tunnels that connected villages, tunnels that allowed combatants to appear in one place and disappear in another. Tunnels that protected weapons, food, and command centers. To American soldiers who had been trained to fight in open fields or cities, this seemed like something from another kind of war. One infantry veteran would later recall something simple he said that day. "We thought we controlled the terrain, but the terrain had another level." This discovery created a new challenge. It wasn't enough to find the tunnels. They had to be explored. And it was at this point that the war began to demand something even more difficult from American soldiers: individual courage at an extreme level. Because the tunnels were too narrow for large teams, many of them were less than a meter wide. In some sections, it was necessary to crawl. There was no room for long rifles. There was no room for heavy equipment. Only one man could enter at a time. Imagine for a moment something that anyone can understand outside of war. Think about entering a dark basement alone. Think about going down a staircase where the light doesn't work and you don't know what's at the end. Now imagine doing this knowing that there might be traps, explosives, or someone waiting in the dark. That's exactly what some American soldiers began to do, voluntarily. They were given a pistol, a small flashlight, and sometimes just a knife. Then they would crouch down before the tunnel entrance and disappear into the darkness. These men became known among the troops by a name that seemed simple but carried enormous weight: tunnel rats. The name might seem strange to those who had never been there, but among the soldiers it meant something very clear. It meant someone who was willing to go where almost no one else wanted to go. Their job was to advance slowly inside the tunnel, check for traps, identify branches, and discover if there were hidden enemy combatants. Sometimes the tunnels were empty, other times not. In some cases, the soldiers found hidden weapons depots or maps. In others, they found signs that combatants had escaped just minutes before, and occasionally they encountered resistance. Combat in a tunnel was completely different from any other war situation. There was no distance, there was no room for maneuver. It was a fast, brutal, and silent fight. Many tunnel rats said after the war that the hardest moment wasn't the combat itself, it was the moment before. The moment when you stood before the tunnel entrance, breathing deeply, knowing that in a few seconds you would be completely alone in the dark. But there was something that kept these men moving forward, something many veterans would immediately recognize. It was a sense of responsibility for their comrades above ground, because every unexplored tunnel could conceal a future ambush. Every unmapped passage could allow fighters to emerge behind American lines. So they kept going in, one tunnel after another, and the more they explored, the more they realized something that began to worry American commanders. The underground network wasn't just large, it was immense. Some tunnels stretched for miles, some had multiple levels, some possessed secret exits in completely unexpected places. It was at this point that many soldiers began to realize that the war in Vietnam was being fought in two worlds simultaneously. One visible world on the surface, and another invisible one just below the earth. And as the tunnel rats continued exploring that subterranean labyrinth, a question began to arise among the troops. If that network of tunnels was so large, what else could be hidden down there that no one had yet seen? The first descent into a tunnel was rarely forgotten by those who made it. Not because it was the most difficult, but because it was the moment when each soldier realized they were entering a completely different kind of war. The opening in the ground seemed small from above. However, as the body began to slide into the earth, the sensation changed rapidly. The daylight disappeared behind their backs, and the air grew heavier with each meter. The smell was a mixture of damp earth, old wood, and stale smoke. Some soldiers later said that the silence inside those tunnels seemed louder than any battle noise. You didn't hear helicopters, you didn't hear radios, you didn't hear your comrades, only your own breathing. And this led many to wonder something simple but disturbing. How many people had already passed through that corridor before them? The tunnels weren't built randomly. Over time, the tunnel rats began to notice patterns. There were false entrances made solely to lure soldiers into traps. There were narrow passages that suddenly widened into small underground rooms. Some of these rooms had makeshift tables, lanterns, maps, and even simple ventilation systems made of bamboo. At certain points, the tunnel descended even deeper, creating different levels. What seemed like a simple corridor could transform into an entire network of paths. For a soldier crawling alone in the dark, each turn raised a new question. Would that passage lead to an arms depot or an ambush? And how could they know before turning the corner? Veterans' accounts show that the greatest enemy inside the tunnels wasn't always the opposing combatant. Often it was the traps. Some were extremely simple, sharpened stakes fixed to the bottom of hidden holes in the ground. Others were more elaborate, using grenades connected to almost invisible wires. There were also wooden boxes filled with insects or snakes, positioned to frighten or injure anyone who entered unprepared. Imagine advancing only a few centimeters at a time, illuminating the path with a weak flashlight, knowing that a single wrong move could be fatal. At that moment, many soldiers learned to slow down their thinking. Every gesture needed to be calculated, every breath needed to be controlled. But what happens to the human mind when it remains too long in an environment like that? Some tunnel rats said that the sensation of time inside the tunnels was different. 5 minutes could feel like half an hour. The body tensed, the muscles stiffened, and the mind tried to anticipate everything at once. There were moments when a soldier could hear the distant sound of someone moving on the other side of an earthen wall. It was impossible to know if it was just the echo of their own movement or someone else breathing in the dark. This kind of uncertainty created a type of psychological tension that few military training programs could replicate. And yet, many of these men returned to the tunnels multiple times. Why? The answer was often simple: because someone needed to do it. The tunnels weren't just hiding places. They allowed fighters to emerge behind American patrols, store ammunition, and organize surprise attacks. Each mapped section reduced that risk. Each trap discovered could save lives on the surface. A U.S. Army soldier recounted years later that he thought of his friends above him as he advanced underground. He knew that if he didn't discover that passage, someone could be ambushed the next day. This thought transformed fear into something different. It didn't disappear, but it gained a purpose. But as more tunnels were explored, another question began to arise among the officers. How far did this network really extend? Some captured maps indicated that the tunnels in certain regions were tens of kilometers long. Other accounts suggested that entire villages were connected by these passages. In areas like Cu Chi, the system seemed to function like an underground city. There were rest areas, storage areas, and even makeshift infirmaries. This meant that the war wasn't just happening on the surface of the jungle, it was also happening in an invisible world, where the terrain favored those who knew every curve and every secret exit. For American soldiers, this represented an enormous strategic challenge. How could they fight an enemy that could literally disappear into the ground? Despite these difficulties, American units began to adapt their strategies. Military engineers began studying ways to locate hidden entrances. Specialized teams began working alongside the tunnel rats, recording every tunnel found. Some operations were specifically organized to destroy large underground networks. But even with all this effort, one thing became clear to many veterans: that war demanded a rare combination of technology, courage, and human adaptation. Because no machine could replace the moment when a soldier had to decide to enter the darkness alone. And as more tunnels were explored, another discovery slowly began to emerge, a discovery that would make many Americans realize that this underground network hid something even bigger than traps or weapons depots. What exactly was being coordinated down there, out of everyone's sight? As more tunnels were explored, American soldiers began to realize something few had imagined when they arrived in Vietnam: that underground network was not just an improvised guerrilla strategy. It was a complex system planned for years, capable of sustaining entire military operations with almost nothing visible on the surface. Some of the most extensive networks were located in the Cu Chi region, a few kilometers from Saigon. What seemed like just dense jungle hid a veritable underground labyrinth. Estimates made during the war indicated more than 200 kilometers of tunnels connecting villages, observation posts, weapons depots, and command centers. For many American soldiers, the first reaction upon hearing these numbers was disbelief. How could such a large system exist unnoticed for so long? This question circulated among the units like an enigma that no one could fully answer. The tunnel rats advancing through these corridors began to notice details that revealed the level of organization of that structure. In certain places, there were small vertical openings that functioned as ventilation, hidden among roots or bamboo trunks. In other sections, there were camouflaged doors made of wood and compacted earth, almost impossible to identify without careful examination. Some tunnels had slopes designed to prevent gases or smoke from spreading rapidly if an entrance was attacked. In certain underground rooms, the soldiers found hand-drawn maps, improvised lanterns, and tools used to dig new passages. This revealed something important. The tunnels were not just hiding places. They were an extension of the war strategy itself, but even with such an elaborate system, there was something many American veterans remember clearly when talking about that period: the ability of US troops to adapt quickly. Within months, military engineers began developing specific methods to locate hidden entrances. Some units started using motion detectors, trained dogs, and excavation equipment to identify suspicious areas. Helicopters flew over regions where there were signs of tunnels, while teams on the ground analyzed every detail of the vegetation. It was a constant effort of intelligence and military engineering. And this adaptability was something deeply rooted in the culture of the American Armed Forces, facing unexpected challenges and finding solutions. One example that many historians cite occurred during operations near the so-called Iron Triangle, a strategic region used by communist forces for troop and supply movements. After weeks of intense patrols, American units managed to locate several important entrances to the underground network. Military engineers used controlled charges and specialized equipment to destroy large sections of tunnels. It was a complex operation that required coordination between infantry, engineering, and air support. The result was not merely tactical. It demonstrated something essential about how the United States conducted the war: a combination of technology, organization, and individual courage. Even so, there were moments that surprised even the most experienced soldiers. On a patrol near Cu Chi, a tunnel rat was slowly advancing through a narrow corridor when he noticed something unexpected. The passage he was following began to widen until it reached an underground room larger than any he had ever seen. There were makeshift tables, supply boxes, and even a small clay stove used for cooking without releasing much smoke onto the surface. This discovery made it clear that the underground network was capable of sustaining operations for extended periods. It was almost like a hidden military base within the earth. This type of discovery raised new questions for American commanders. How many of these installations were still hidden? At the same time, American forces continued to display a characteristic that many veterans remember with pride: solidarity among comrades. Each tunnel rat knew that by entering a tunnel, he was protecting the men who remained on the surface. Each engineer working to locate an entrance was helping to prevent a future ambush. This team spirit was something deeply ingrained in the United States military culture. It wasn't just about winning battles. It was about protecting the man next to you. Another aspect that surprised many soldiers was the difference between the two worlds that coexisted in that conflict. Above ground, Huey helicopters crisscrossed the sky, transporting troops, radios transmitted information in real time, and airplanes provided air support with advanced technology. It was the industrial and technological power of the United States in action. But below ground, the war was fought with simple tools, narrow corridors, and improvised traps. Two completely different styles of combat existed simultaneously. This difference made many soldiers reflect on the nature of that war. Over time, operations against the tunnels began to reduce some of the enemy's mobility in certain regions. However, each new discovery also showed how vast that system was. Some tunnels led to others even deeper. Some passages had hidden exits hundreds of meters away from the original entrance. This kept American soldiers constantly alert, because with each tunnel destroyed, a new question arose. How many more existed that no one had yet found? And as the tunnel rats continued exploring that subterranean world, a realization began to grow among many officers and soldiers. That network of tunnels wasn't just a military curiosity. It was connected to something bigger, something that helped explain why this war was so different from all previous ones. And the more the Americans investigated, the closer they came to a surprising conclusion about the true scale of the conflict they were facing. As operations continued, many American soldiers began to realize that the war in Vietnam could not be understood simply by looking at maps or military reports. There was something profoundly different about that conflict. Each tunnel discovered revealed a new detail, a fragment of a reality more complex than any briefing could explain. On some occasions, when the tunnel rats ventured deeper into the underground passages, they found small spaces that appeared to have been used for long periods. There were makeshift containers for storing water, handmade digging tools, and small pieces of fabric used as makeshift beds. These details showed that those networks were not merely temporary structures for combat. They functioned as part of a system that allowed the enemy to survive for extended periods without being seen. Meanwhile, life above ground continued at an intense pace for American troops. Huey helicopters transported entire units between forward bases, landing in clearings in the middle of the jungle. The sound of these aircraft became one of the most striking symbols of the war. For many soldiers, hearing the rotor of an approaching Huey meant two important things: mobility and support. The ability to move troops quickly was one of the greatest advantages of American forces. While the enemy hid in the terrain and tunnels, the United States used its logistical and technological strength to maintain a presence in vast regions of the country. This difference between the two sides created a striking contrast. In the sky, helicopters and airplanes represented American industrial power. On the ground, patrols advanced with discipline and organization. And underground, an invisible world attempted to sustain a war based on stealth and surprise. For many veterans, this contrast defined the Vietnam experience. It was like fighting in 3 dimensions at once. In a letter home, one soldier wrote something simple that captured this feeling well. He said that in Vietnam, you could look up and see the strength of America in the sky, but you needed to look down to understand the true challenge of the war. Despite these difficulties, American soldiers continued to demonstrate a characteristic that many veterans remember with pride: the ability to maintain discipline and camaraderie, even in the most difficult situations. In the makeshift bases and camps, there were times when the men tried to recreate small pieces of the life they had left behind. Some listened to music on portable radios, others wrote letters to their families, describing only part of the reality they faced. Many avoided recounting the more serious details so as not to worry those at home. These letters became a silent link between two completely different worlds. Between operations, there were also moments of reflection. Some soldiers began to realize that Vietnam was teaching lessons that no military training had fully anticipated. The war wasn't just about technology or firepower, it was also about adaptation, resilience, and understanding the environment. Each patrol demanded absolute attention. Every movement needed to be calculated, and every decision could directly affect the safety of the entire group. Stories of individual courage began to circulate among the units. A tunnel rat who returned from a tunnel, bringing important information about an underground network. A helicopter pilot who landed under intense fire to rescue isolated soldiers. A military medic who worked for hours, treating wounded soldiers in extremely difficult conditions. These episodes became part of the troops' collective memory. They weren't stories told to impress. They were stories that reminded everyone why they continued fighting. Meanwhile, military operations continued, attempting to reduce the enemy's ability to use the terrain and tunnels to their advantage. Military engineers destroyed passages, infantry patrolled strategic areas, and special units investigated new regions where underground networks might exist. It was continuous and demanding work. Even when one tunnel complex was destroyed, there was always the possibility of another being built somewhere nearby. This required constant vigilance. But as time passed, another realization began to emerge among many American soldiers. That war wasn't just being fought on the military field, it was also being closely watched by the entire world. The decisions made in Vietnam had a much greater political, strategic, and symbolic impact than anything else. At that moment, when the first coordinated attacks began during Tet, many American soldiers realized they were living through one of those moments that years later would be remembered as a turning point. It wasn't just another confrontation in the jungle. It wasn't just another patrol or another isolated attack. It was as if all the tension accumulated over months had finally emerged at once. The silence of the early morning was replaced by the sound of gunfire, explosions, and urgent radio transmissions. In various cities and bases, men who just hours before had been resting or writing letters home were now in combat positions. For many veterans who lived through those days, the memory remains clear. The initial shock was swift, but the response was even faster. American units reacted with discipline, organization, and an impressive capacity for adaptation. Helicopters began crisscrossing the sky carrying reinforcements. Medical teams mobilized immediately. Officers coordinated defensive movements while soldiers protected strategic positions. What seemed like an unexpected attack met with a firm response. As the hours and days passed, it became clear that something bigger was happening. The offensives that began in different parts of Vietnam were linked. It was a clear attempt to cause a psychological, political, and military impact all at once. But there was something that perhaps the planners of that attack hadn't fully calculated: the resilience of the American troops and their allies. In several cities, positions that should have fallen quickly managed to hold out. Bases that were under intense pressure continued to operate. Soldiers who had been caught off guard managed to reorganize their lines and counterattack. For many on the battlefield, that moment revealed a simple yet powerful truth. Even in a complex environment like Vietnam, discipline, training, and team spirit could make the difference between collapse and resistance. But there is also a human dimension that needs to be remembered. Behind each uniform was a young person who, just a few months earlier, might have been studying, working, or living an ordinary life in some American city. Many of them were just over 20 years old. Yet in that distant and difficult environment, They demonstrated a courage that deeply touched all who served alongside them. Some veterans say it was during those days that they understood something important about war and about themselves. War reveals not only the strength of a country, but also the strength of the people who represent it. In the midst of chaos, stories of solidarity, sacrifice and loyalty emerge that rarely appear in military strategy textbooks. There were soldiers who rushed to rescue wounded comrades under intense fire, doctors who worked tirelessly to save lives, pilots who landed helicopters in extremely dangerous areas to rescue isolated men. These moments weren't planned in maps or reports. They happened because someone decided to act. Over time, the events of that period began to be analyzed by historians and military experts. Strategies were debated. Political decisions were discussed. But for those who were there, what remains strongest is not just the analysis. It's the memories, the sound of helicopters on the horizon, the smell of the jungle after a rainy night, the tension of a patrol advancing along an unknown trail, and above all, the faces of the men who shared that moment in history. Perhaps that is one of the greatest lessons of that conflict. The history of the Vietnam War is not just about battles or global Cold War strategies, it is also about people. About young people who faced extreme situations and yet found the strength to move forward. And when we look back today, decades later, an inevitable question arises. How many of these stories still remain unspoken? How many veterans carry memories they never had the opportunity to share? Perhaps that's precisely why telling these stories remains so important. Not just to understand history, but to acknowledge what those generations lived through. For many, Vietnam is not just a chapter in a book, it's an experience that changed their lives forever. If you've watched this far, there's a good chance this story has sparked something in you. Maybe curiosity, maybe respect, maybe personal memories or stories you've heard from someone in your family. If this content made you reflect or learn something new, subscribe to the channel to follow future videos. Also, leave a like, because that helps the channel continue bringing stories like this. And especially, if you or someone in your family lived through that time, leave a comment sharing your experience or your questions. Many of the best stories in history are still kept in people's memories, and perhaps in one of those comments lies the next story we all need to hear. Isolated patrol in the jungle. This meant that every operation, every battle, and every underground discovery was part of something bigger within the context of the Cold War. It was in this context that decisive events began to approach. Intelligence information indicated that the enemy was preparing something on a large scale. Unusual movements were observed in various regions. Some tunnel networks seemed more active than before. Intercepted messages suggested coordination between different units. For many American soldiers, these clues began to raise an inevitable question. Were all those underground networks being used to prepare something much bigger than isolated attacks? No one yet knew exactly what was to come, but there was a growing sense among the troops that the war was about to enter a new phase. Something was being prepared behind the scenes of that conflict. And when it finally came to light, it would show the whole world that Vietnam was not just a series of jungle battles, but a much broader confrontation within the global context of the Cold War.